This is the
Five Stars
podcast.
Let me talk to you.
Hi.
So, what do you guys want to talk about? Tell me when I'm telling lies.
Thanks, guys. Back to you.
Well, we're going to see how this one goes. I wasn't exactly sure how to title this, in all honesty. I kept juggling back and forth between trying to go for the clickbaity title, or I just outright say, John Cena's heel turn won't work, and here's why. But I just hate that kind of scheming to generate traffic on YouTube, because it's not authentic. It's just a way designed to cheat the algorithms. Believe it or not, contrary to what people might think, I'm not a red meat channel. I don't use false titles and false video graphics to drive viewership. I mean, everything about what I do here is to try to be as realistic and cogent as I can be. My opinions are one thing, but at least you know that they're my opinions, if nothing else. And I never try to tell my audience how to think or believe about something. And that's going to be a tough path to navigate when I get into Seg 1 on this week's Monday show, going more into depth about the conversation with the John Cena heel turn, the potential outcomes we'll see as a result of the turn, what it all means. I won't keep you waiting for long, but I do want to quickly say that if you're checking out the Five Starr Wrestling Report for the first time, make sure to subscribe, comment, like the show if you have not already. We are the wrestling channel that nobody knows but everybody needs. I nearly butchered that intro there. And we are here on YouTube and Rumble Mondays and Fridays to bring you fun wrestling coverage of classic wrestling and WWE PLEs. I always have to hairpin that in there as a sidebar, because it's the only modern wrestling coverage that I do on this channel now, which was not the case several years ago. You can't fault me for trying. I did the AEW experiment, and it only took me a couple years to realize that this is a complete waste of my time. Today's a little bit of an unorthodox Monday show because of the topic we're going to cover in a couple seconds here. But we will talk about Retro Raw at the very end, so make sure you stay tuned for that as well. But with that said, I've been hyping this thing up for the better part of the last week. Said we were going to talk about it. So let's talk about it. Where do I currently stand with the John Cena heel turn 3 weeks after the Elimination Chamber? We've had a few weeks to come down from the LSD markout trip of actually seeing the heel turn. Now everybody's starting to put their rational thinking caps on and trying to objectively analyze whether or not this is going to be something good for WWE's long-term business. Now, in all fairness, I would say it's discernibly still too early to judge. I mean, we still haven't seen Cena show up on Raw to address the whole matter, which should already be raising some red flags right there. I mean, we're coming up on week 3 following one of the biggest angles in modern wrestling in the last 20 plus years. It's been radio silent. Outside a couple passionate babyface promos from Punk and Cody, which, I mean, that's fine. But we do need to hear the whys and hows from the heels' perspective. Because that's the only thing that truly matters in this conversation. And I said during the Chamber review, I'll just give you the Cliff's Notes recap so we can expand on a couple other talking points that I wanted to tackle. I've said that everything about this story has the potential to be epic. If they can carry the ball to the finish line. But there are many things that need to naturally fall into place in order for them to truly pull off a John Cena heel turn in WWE. There needs to be longevity to it. There needs to be a well-crafted, rational explanation that justifies why now is the point where Cena is selling out and turning his back on his morals. At this stage of his career, and if the explanation is simply, this is my last opportunity to break the record of world title wins, my last chance to cement myself as the greatest of all time, this isn't about the fans. This isn't about doing what's right. It's about doing what's best for me and my career. And if Rock is his guaranteed meal ticket to obtaining that record, fine. You can coherently tell that story if you wanted to. But again, not only does that need to be explained on television to the audience, we need to hear it from John. Not The Rock. Not any of the top babyfaces. Nobody should be speaking for Cena in this case. We need to hear it from him. Along with any other valid claim as to why he's chosen the Hollywood route. And then on top of that, going back to the longevity thing, again, I talked about this in the Chamber review very briefly. I still maintain this opinion now. I hate, let me emphasize again, I hate this bullshit, stupid notion that's being propagated from the internet fans about how the Cena heel turn doesn't have to be this deep-rooted, elongated story. It most certainly does. I think it's an incredibly stupid take to say, oh, he can just turn babyface by the end of the year. Fuck that noise, dude. This is a heel turn that the diehards have been on hands and knees begging for since fucking 2012. For some, even going back sooner than that. You do not go through all the trouble of turning one of your poster boy babyfaces for the WWE brand after years of anticipation to literally have the damn thing last 6 months. And yes, if you want to debate subtle details, we can make a valid case that John Cena has essentially been a heel in the eyes of a lot of fans going back to the late 2000s, as well as the early to mid-2010s. And if you need any kind of fact check to support that claim, go watch any episode of Raw or SmackDown when Cena was on top from the year 2009 up until about 2015. You will not find a bigger heel on the roster during that time than John Felix Anthony Cena. However, this is not a 6-month investment. This has to be at least a 12 to 18 month story of Cena riding that wave of momentum and really being the true obstacle that he's essentially been for the better part of the last 20 years for WWE. I'm sorry, but there's not enough time in a 6-month window to effectively tell the story of Cena going against everything he's ever represented as WWE's poster boy. Not if the goal is to actually make this story mean something. And this is where selective dates are going to be extremely dicey when it comes to Cena's availability. And, when I kind of look back now, this is bullshit false advertising on WWE's part. I mean, you really think about it. When Cena made that announcement last year that he was doing this retirement tour, he kind of made it apparent in that promo that 2025 was going to be more of a full-time schedule for him. Not to say he was going to be on every Raw and SmackDown or wrestle at every PLE, but the idea was planted that, hey, we're going to see John a little more frequently than we were seeing in the previous several years. So that opens the opportunity for them to really ride that gravy train. Get as much mileage out of them as they possibly can, while they still can. And while we've seen him wrestle at the Royal Rumble in the Elimination Chamber, how many dates did they actually lock him down for? I think I read it was something like 30, 33, 34, 35. And that's not 35 weeks. That's 35 dates. Singular. And I think he's already appeared in 2025, 3 or 4 times on television? Couple press scrum cameos. So they've got him committed to basically another 30 or so appearances now. That might seem like a lot on paper, but if you really think about it, if you're trying to generate real heat and story hype with him in the top babyfaces, trying to utilize him effectively to make all those potential matches mean something, that's not a lot of screen time. And what are those potential babyface pairings that you could do? Well, the obvious choice, you got Punk and Cena. That feud kind of writes itself. Again, though, you're still going to need promos and angles and interviews to build that up and make it valuable. There's Cena and Orton, which is kind of a unique dynamic in the sense that it would be the first time where we'd see these two working together where the heel-face personas were totally reversed. And again, there's plenty of history between those two. The 900 billion goddamn matches those two had over the years that drove people absolutely insane. What about a babyface Jacob Fatu? Or a babyface Braun Breaker? Those could be real big money matches in helping to establish Fatu and Breaker as the next faces of the future generation of this company. It would do more service for them than it ever did Austin Theory. I think there's a natural inbuilt program you could do with a babyface Roman Reigns. Maybe a Seth Rollins. The point here is that they have options. And admittedly, that might be too much of a good thing in this case. Because you look at that roster of names, Punk, Orton, Reigns, Fatu, Breaker, potentially a Rollins or a Jey Uso, if for whatever reason you wanted to experiment with that possibility. Gunther. So it's like, people are conceiving of all these potential dream matches you could do. And a lot of them make logical sense, but how many of those babyface heel pairings can you feasibly fit into a 6-month window? Much less 12 to 18 months. And I know there's been a lot of drama circulating the wrestling media in the last week or two about how much the Cena heel turn was planned in advance, the thought process behind everything that went down, whether or not Cena was the go-to all along. I mean, now we're opening a whole other can of worms. It just warrants its own video topic. Listen, It is a very polarizing topic right now to criticize anything about Dwayne. There's a very passionate yet bizarre subset of the wrestling community, internet fans in particular, that just despise any modicum of criticism for The Rock. And to me, it's kind of weird. I don't really understand it. I've always been a fan of The Rock. I think he ranks among the all-time greats in terms of box office attractions and megastars in the pantheon of WWF, WWE history. I don't think anybody can deny that. But two things can be true at once. You can be an all-time great. That doesn't make you untouchable. It doesn't make you flawless. The Undertaker is my favorite wrestler of all time. Doesn't mean that I've never had anything critical to say about him. For reference, go listen to my Retro Raw reports over the last 3 years. Haven't been the biggest fan of Taker's feuds. Of course, that's more of a reflection on Vince being a terrible booker, but the point remains. I'm not just going to say everything The Undertaker did in his career was great, because that would be a lie. And whether or not the rumors are true about Cody being the initial pick to turn heel over John, whether those plans were scrapped because Cody put his foot down and said, no, I don't want to do it, and then they went with John as the second pick, I don't know what holds water and what doesn't. My inclination as a skeptical wrestling fan is to immediately discount anything dirt sheets try to claim, because 90% of the time they're full of shit. Especially when it's coming from the mouth of Dave Meltzer. To me, though, it really doesn't matter, because even in this argument, I think people are still missing the point. The criticism about The Rock, to me, is less about any creative input he's had over the last how many months in the lead up to the Elimination Chamber. It's more so about the fans' conceptualization and this BS rationalizing that every segment involving The Rock in the lead up to the Chamber made sense. Again, two things can be true. The plan may have in fact been for Cena to turn heel all along. And everything we've seen along the way has been part of this genius Rock creation where he kept the fans guessing and planted all these clues along the way to allude to the turn. But objectively speaking, and again, I'm just calling this as somebody that's empirically been watching those clips on Raw and doing my due diligence and trying to make sense of the whole thing just like everybody else watching. I thought those segments sucked. They made no sense at the time. Even in retrospect, as I go back and try to cherry pick the details of everything Rock's been involved with since the fall of last year up to this point, there are still a lot of gaping plot holes that don't make a ton of sense to me. Things that have not been explained, answers that have gone completely to the wayside. Why was The Rock constantly flipping between face and heel? Why did he show up completely at random back in the fall of last year, only to literally disappear for another 3 to 4 months, never to be heard from? Moreover, if Cena was the planned guy to align with Rock from the onset, and we're to presume that Rock and Cena had already negotiated this before the Elimination Chamber, why did you need this overly convoluted, puzzling, fucking sexually provocative interplay between Cody and Rock on SmackDown where Rock is talking about wanting Cody's soul or wanting him to come with Cody to the Casbah? What would have been the explanation if Cody was just like, okay, sure, Rock, I'll join forces with you. Was Rock just supposed to be like, well, John, no need for you then. I got what I needed. Look, I've been watching wrestling a long time. I know how fickle fans are. It's why I've always had a hard time really engaging with anybody in the community. I've listened to podcasters, I've watched a ton of reviews, read a ton of reports over the years. I tried to follow the dirt sheets at one point and just gave up trying because so much of it just came off as biased to me. People that really didn't know what they were talking about, that somehow got into this industry and probably have no business being in it. As much as I love pro wrestling, and I love to come on here and share my opinions with everybody, again, I'm very appreciative of the audience that comes back to check out everything that I do. I also recognize how much I loathe everything about modern wrestling fan podcasts and journalists and news reporters and scouters. Anybody that considers himself an insider. Because so much of the time I just find that I share nothing in common with them. And that really shouldn't be the case if you think about it, right? I mean, I'm somebody that's been watching pro wrestling for a very long time. Does that make me an insider? Does it make me a smart fan or a mark? Perhaps so. But then again, maybe I have more in common with the casual fans these days than I do the people inside the business. Or the fans that have been watching wrestling for as long as I have. And again, just to use an example, this idea that you're forbidden from criticizing anything about The Rock's booking ideas, I mean, that's coming from the same crew of people that complain when guys like me talk about how shitty Hunter's booking is. Because he's a shitty booker. Sorry if that pisses any of you off. I watched plenty of the Paul Levesque era of WWE, the post-Vince regime. I tried to sit here and review 2 hours of SmackDown a couple years ago. It was the most miserable experience of my life. The shows fucking sucked. There's way too much emphasis on bad indie girls wrestling. Too many repetitive matches and boring segments with people that I didn't give a crap about and with people who weren't over with the audience to begin with. The whole garbage with Uncle Howdy, which I don't even want to get into now. Damn near killed LA Knight's career as a result. Make no mistake, Tony Khan is an absolutely abhorrent booker when it comes to his ideas for AEW. But to try and sit here and say Triple H is any kind of booking prodigy or savant, to me that's just delusional and foolish. I don't know the kind of influence Rock has when it comes to inserting his ideas into the product or changing things around at the last minute. Considering all the drama that happened last year between Rumble and Mania season, where they tried to have Cody give up his WrestleMania spot to The Rock so he could have that dream match with Roman that nobody was asking for. Then they very quickly backpedaled after the fan recoil. I mean, I don't put anything past Rock in 2025. But I just can't wrap my head around this. It doesn't compute. I don't hate The Rock. I don't have any personal gripe against him. I don't particularly care about his movie franchises because I don't watch movies. To me, the movie industry is kind of a lost cause. But I think it's moronic to sit here and say, you can't criticize The Rock's ideas because everything made sense along the way. This is all part of long-term booking. No. No, it is not. It did not make sense along the way. There was nothing coherently explained on television to give you the indication that any of this was well thought out. And like for all the people that are saying, oh, the Easter eggs, you're not paying attention to the subtle details. Well, now everyone just sounds like an AEW mark, where the only way to understand what's going on is to follow every breadcrumb they leave you along the way that nobody in their right mind is ever going to pick up on. Because here's the reality of the situation, people. No sensible person watches television like that. We're watching for logical, coherent interplay between babyfaces and heels where the plots are laid out, we know who to cheer for and who to hate, and we know what the objective and the end goal is for both parties involved. That is the way wrestling used to be booked, when it was simple and easy to follow, and it made sense. Back before it was booked for fucking ADHD basement dwellers with photographic memories. And here's a real bone of contention I have to this whole Rock criticism thing. And this is where the hypocrisy of modern wrestling fans drives me up a wall. You want to know how I know this whole topic is completely and utterly ridiculous? The same marks that are sitting here and saying, oh, this is great, Rock is a genius, this was so well planned out, everything ties together and it made sense the whole time. Those are the exact same fans that literally sat here and skewered the shit out of that Rock-Cody confrontation a month back, where they were sitting there just as confused and dazed as everybody else, saying none of it makes sense, it's a hodgepodge of nonsensical word vomit. Because that is exactly what that promo face-off was. I like The Rock, I like Cody. That segment was ass. It was nonsensical, rambling word vomit, with mainly The Rock being the perpetrator of it. I think it really comes down to this. We're going to look back 5 to 10 years from now and really be able to get a better judgment on how this whole John Cena heel turn thing works in the long haul. And maybe for some people out there, Cena going heel for 6 to 9 months and then turning babyface right before he officially retires, whatever arc of redemption story they want to vindicate in their minds to justify how it would make sense. Maybe for those people, it's satisfying enough. But then the conversation boils down to how effective it was in the first place. Not judging whether it was good or bad, but whether or not it was effective. Did it move the needle for the company? Did it help to generate a new star or two? Did it give the viewers a proper perception on why Cena would decide in the twilight of his career to turn his back on everything he once stood for in the previous era? When he really never signaled at the idea that turning heel was ever an option? What did he ever do on television to show signs of dissension? The only thing I could ever pick up on was the way that he won the Chamber match, when he just capitalized on Rollins giving Punk the curb stomp. That was one moment. And that was in a moment that counted because it basically cemented Cena's title match with Cody for WrestleMania. But even going back before that, did he ever cut a promo showing signs of heel turn? Did he work a match or was involved in an angle that kind of signaled something was off? Not to my recollection. And listen, I don't deny that moment was still impactful. When you look back 15 to 20 years from now, everybody's going to remember that look that Cena gave The Rock right before he kicked Cody in the balls and beat the shit out of him. But that is just the opening chapter to the whole novel. And this is the issue with modern wrestling now, where I talk about it all the time. Modern pro wrestling is a reactionary business now. It's not about good guys overcoming and defying obstacles. It's not about getting heat. It's not about pissing off the fans enough to get them to want to pay a ticket to come see the bad guy get put in his place. It's all about reactions. It's about trying to get the next clip for the fucking highlight reel package. It's about promo face-offs where it's less about two guys explaining why they hate each other, and it's more about them trying to drop one-liners to get a burn reaction from the audience. It's just the reality of where things are now. We can debate whether or not it's good or bad, but I don't like to debate in those terms. I like to debate practicality. And when you look at the scope of the timeline for WWE in the last year, what was the last feud where you kind of sat back and said, I kind of buy the idea that these two hate each other? Punk and McIntyre. But that's a rarity by today's standards. It's why that feud is going to become an all-time classic when you look back at history. Because unlike so much of what anybody else was doing at the time, in terms of feuds and matches, you actually bought the idea that these two legitimately did not like one another. And maybe they don't. I can certainly buy that there's a level of animosity these two share with each other. Who fucking knows? But that's the point. We're supposed to think they hate each other. It's called a work for a reason. Again, it goes back to the whole history of pro wrestling. How do you generate tickets? How do you generate an audience? How do you get people wanting to come back to see the programs and the feuds? You got to get the audience to believe that whoever's feuding with each other really dislike each other. That they want to rip each other's heads off for real in a working fashion. Do you really get that in today's business? Do you really? How many feuds come up in today's era where you actually think, I can sense that there's something behind the scenes between these two that doesn't click? Even with Rollins and Punk, to an extent, I can believe that there's a little bit of a jealousy between the two, that Rollins secretly kind of despises what Punk represents. I could believe it on the surface, but do I actually buy that those two want to go at each other and really hurt each other? Not really. So, to bring it back to Cena here, there is a lot of stuff you can do with having all the top babyfaces stand up to him, truly speak their minds. I mean, you want to cross that realm between work and shoot. Give the guys a platform to really express how they think and feel about John as a person. Now's the time. Stretch the boundaries a little bit. But the question is, how far are they willing to go with it? That's the catch-22. And here's how I look at it. To me, if they just run with a lame duck Cena heel run where he's barely on television and the whole thing doesn't even last a year before they flip him face again, well, then the whole thing's just a giant waste of time. And I'll have been vindicated with all the prejudging that I did when I said, I don't think WWE is going to be able to pull this off. And that comes from, years and years and years and years of letdown after letdown after letdown after letdown after fucking letdown. Especially when it came to anything Cena was involved with. I had hope for the original Nexus in 2010. Cena fucking ruined that. I had hope for the Summer of Punk angle when they did that story in 2011. Cena fucking ruined that. I had hope for a Cena heel turn after he lost to The Rock at WrestleMania in 2012, when it made the most sense to do it. No, both Vince and Cena ruined that, mainly Vince. I had hoped that they would start to eventually phase him out a little more as the popularity of guys like Bryan Danielson and Miro and Bray Wyatt and Kevin Owens started to take off in the mid-2010s. The crop of guys that you could envision being viable main eventers in WWE for years to come. And what happened? They fed them all to Cena. And they were never the same afterwards. Or in the case of a Danielson, it was just shit luck. And it's not just exclusive to those guys. Wade Barrett, Zack Ryder, Damian Sandow, remember him? Ryback. Who else am I forgetting? Remember when they had Mark Henry do a fake retirement speech on Raw, literally just to turn around and have him job the fucking Cena at the very next pay-per-view? Christ. They brought back Brock fucking Lesnar and had him job the Cena in his first match back in 10 years. And I don't want to hear the excuse from people, oh, that was a Vince call, purely him. Cena was a top babyface in WWE by that point for a very long time. You're telling me that guy didn't have any kind of political sway with his matches? Please. Even Cena's had ample opportunity to tell Vince, nah, I think we should have so-and-so go over instead. I think it'd be better for business. Conveniently enough, that rarely ever happened during the decade of doom that was John Cena's run. That's why business was in the tank for as long as it was. Hell, it's why I stopped watching WWE altogether from like 2005 until 2010, when I started doing a little more casual browsing. And lo and behold, during that time, they were still having Cena ram down people's throats left and right. This is their chance to exploit all of that. Let the boys run wild and give it to Super Cena straight. Because it's all shit we're going to know about. We just never really heard it publicized when Cena wasn't trying to spin it the other way. Now he can't spin it. Because he is now the obstacle that all the babyfaces are looking to go after. I am curious to know your thoughts on the Cena heel turn. You know, I've said a lot between the Chamber review and now this. Hopefully you know where I stand on everything. I think this will end up going down as one of the greatest examples in pro wrestling history of a golden missed opportunity. Something they attempted about 12 to 13 years past the expiration date. And they're trying to do what should have been done in 2012, but now they're force-fitting everything into a 2025 time frame. It's like trying for the inside the park home run, and right as you're rounding third base to head home, you think you got it in the bag, you slide into home plate, and the catcher throws you out at the very last second. That's what I think it's going to be. And if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. And I will happily look back at this video and say, I was completely and utterly proven wrong. I won't rule it out as a possibility. But on a balance of probability, with all these little details about John's scheduling and the time commitments and his leftover ring time, I just can't envision this being an all-time classic heel run. I think it'll be something that had a lot of hype and a lot of goodwill from fans going in that ultimately will leave people bitterly disappointed. All right, let's dig into Raw. Dig into, bury, however you want to phrase it. As we're tracking the ratings here, trying to do the Monday Night Wars numbers breakdown. I think I mentioned the other week, the lead up to WrestleMania 12 was not good for the WWF. Now, last week was an anomaly because we didn't have a Nitro rating. I believe there was a preemption. Don't ask me what replaced the show the other week. I didn't bother looking it up. If it wasn't the annual Westminster Kennel Dog Show races, I got the first clue. But as I scoured the next several weeks, Raw ends up getting shellacked by Nitro. Now this week they beat Raw doing a 3.2. Raw only did a 2.9. But just to play a bit of spoiler here, there's an interesting pattern we're about to see develop from now until May of this year, when Nitro finally overtakes Raw for the next 83 weeks in the ratings. Raw's numbers really do not fluctuate that much. And I don't know if that's a reflection on the kind of audience they had during the time. The fact that they were mainly down to their core market in terms of weekly viewership. But I'm just rattling off some numbers here. 2.9, 2.9, 2.8, 2.9, 3.1, 3.3, 2.9. Those are like the next 6 to 7 weeks of programming. Oddly enough, there are only two outliers in the lineup here. There's the April 8th show, where Raw does a 4.7, which is massive. The only caveat is that they weren't head-to-head with Nitro that week. Then there's a random 4.1 rating they do on the May 6th episode, which, if memory serves me right, I think that was the weekend of the infamous MSG curtain call. But again, everything kind of hovers around that median 2.9 number, considering how WrestleMania is literally 3 weeks away as of this point. I think it really kind of paints the picture as to where the company was at this time in the early spring of '96. There just wasn't a whole lot of buzz surrounding the product. And if you've been following the TV reviews, it's not really all that shocking. Shows have largely sucked. I think a lot of people weren't on board with the Shawn Michaels babyface push, grooming him to win the title from Bret at WrestleMania. And we've covered ad nauseum the lack of real star power in the WWF around this time. Meanwhile, WCW had just about every big name under the fucking sun. And that still predates Hall and Nash coming in. It's just the reality of where we are at this point. But I thought those numbers were very telling. I mean, that 2.9 was basically the devoted WWF core audience. The audience that was going to watch no matter how good or bad the product was. I don't know mathematically what that translates to in terms of overall viewership. I'm not using the Nielsen media model. Probably somewhere in the ballpark of 3 million, which is essentially what WWE does today, ironically enough. And this was back during a time when the product was at its lowest point. So what does that really tell you about the current state of modern wrestling? Anyway, let's dive into this thing and try to figure out how they could have possibly lost to Nitro this week. They opened with Steve Austin versus Savio Vega. And again, this is pre-Stone Cold era. Even though Vince was pounding the Stone Cold nickname down our throats. Even so, he still referred to him as the Ringmaster momentarily. I'm kind of convinced the only purpose for this match was so Vince could plug Mark Henry sitting at ringside. And yes, this was in fact his WWF debut. I can't recall if he was under contract by this point, but I mean, considering what happened between him and Lawler at the end of the segment, safe to assume that he was pretty much locked down. This would have been right before he competed in the 96 Olympics powerlifting contest. And since you know Vince had a hard-on for weightlifters and big, strong men, well, how are you not going to sign the world's strongest man? In terms of the match with Austin and Savio, you know, again, it's really bizarre when you go back around this time. We often think back to 96 and remember when Austin started organically getting over with the crowd, even though they kept him as a heel through the entirety of the year. But it's really strange when you look at this buffer period of sorts between the Ringmaster and the Stone Cold gimmick. The people just did not give a shit. I mean, they liked Savio, which was kind of expected. Them being in San Antonio, had a pretty heavy Latino population there. But they just... I can't even say they didn't care about Austin. I think they were just apathetic to the whole thing. It's not like the work was bad. Austin was being a heel and trying to work the crowd to the best of his abilities. But you can even tell by this point, he was still missing that cool factor to him. It's one thing for Vince to constantly keep pumping up the Stone Cold catchphrase. When you look at his overall presentation, though, the way he looked, the way he carried himself in the ring, the way he worked, it didn't quite click yet. The Stone Cold gimmick didn't match the ring style. Yeah, he shaved his head and he was growing out the goatee. But he still had the white cowboy boots. Still kind of wrestled a bland traditional heel style that it didn't really match the personality they were trying to get over at the time. And it's like they were close to figuring it out with him, but he needed more seasoning. He needed more time to establish his heel persona to the audience, which unfortunately wasn't something they were prioritizing in the lead up to Mania. I can't even remember offhand if he worked WrestleMania 12. Did he? I mean, the match ended a double count out, so I don't know, maybe they just wound up rematching the two for Mania just to get him on the card. But like the simple fact that I don't remember that match ever happening, that's the main dilemma. Goes to show how unimpactful it was. I mean, Hunter jobbed to the Ultimate Warrior in 8 seconds, but at least I remember that. In any case, they were both going at it after the bell, so the ref had to try to step in to separate the two, which involved him grabbing Austin by the back of the ring trunks and then trying to pull him over out of the corner. If this were Austin in 98, he'd have stunned the shit out of that ref and left him for dead. Here he just got up and tried to go after Savio again. Then Savio tackled him and they both kept brawling until Savio hit a spin kick and sent Austin fleeing. And this is where they showed the replay of Mark Henry press slamming Jerry Lawler before the show went on air. I don't know what the context to any of it was because there was no audio. It was just Henry picking up Lawler and tossing him to the mat. In other words, hey, check out how massively strong this guy is. He just gave another grown man a press slam. Never seen that before in the history of pro wrestling. I forget what Mark was billed at around this time. I know he lost a ridiculous amount of weight over the years. I think he may have been legitimately 400 pounds at this time. Maybe even bigger. Because he sure looked it here when you go back and watch the footage. He was enormous. God, there's so much to talk about with Mark's early WWF career. The peaks and valleys he went through in the first several years he worked there. I think this was covered in that A&E autobiography they ran on him last year. People probably didn't even know about this at the time. I sure as hell didn't. The fact that they signed Mark to a 10-year deal straight out of the block, I was like, Christ, that's essentially a guaranteed contract. Back before the WWF even had guaranteed contracts. Vince couldn't even pay Brett a long-term 10-year plus contract to stay with the company. These people were guaranteeing money to a guy that had never stepped foot in a ring yet? I don't even know how much training he'd have done up to this point. That was crazy when I heard them mention that in Mark's autobiography. And of course, the whole thing was a rush job. It's one of those deals where Vince got high on the looks aspect of them. Didn't really take into account that Mark didn't really understand the business when he first started. He just never progressed at a reasonable rate. He was always getting hurt, or he'd be sent back down to OVW. I mean, everything with him was stop and start. His biggest success in the 90s was arguably his run with the Nation of Domination, right? And that was, what, less than a year? And then you get the whole sexual chocolate gimmick. Got him doing stupid shit with pretending to be a sex addict. I mean, this was back when they were letting Russo go totally unfiltered with the booking. I don't even need to bring up Mae Young in the Hand. Every wrestling fan knows at least a modicum of the bullshit that was. They just never could figure it out with Mark during his first run, and that's really unfortunate. Because then you think, he comes back in the late 2000s, pretty much works all the way through the early to mid-2010s, completely reinvents himself, and then he ends up having one of the best big guy runs in WWE during that entire period. Mark was great during that time. The Hall of Pain stuff, that was awesome. Problem for me was that I wasn't religiously following the product around that time. So anything I ever saw of him, it would either come via the form of a clip or just perusing Raw or SmackDown one week. But yeah, one thing you're never going to hear me say about Mark Henry's initial WWF run was that it was anything shy of a disaster. I mean, at least up until 98 or 99, whichever year it was where they totally lost the plot with him, we can at least appreciate the attempt at trying to book him like a badass. By the Attitude Era, it was a lost cause. But getting back to Raw. Hey, did you know there's a tag team title tournament currently going on? Could have fucking fooled me. I had no idea. When the hell was this announced? Must be watching AEW. Random tournaments taking place on the B show that somehow find their way onto Dynamite. Then everyone's expected to know what the hell's going on. I had no clue what was happening here. They showed a clip of Savio Vega and Razor Ramon beating Tatanka and the 1-2-3 Kid. And now I guess they're going to have the Body Donnas and the Bushwhackers next week. Oh, goody. That sounds like a joyous fucking occasion. Can't wait to kick back and watch that 5-star sensation. By the way, if you were to ask me offhand, who are the previous World Tag Team Champions in this company? I have no clue. I would literally have to go look it up. It may have been the Smoking Guns. I got nothing. Speaking of sensations, I know Goldust was getting a sensational Woody for this exchange with Roddy Piper. This was, well, it was most definitely a Roddy Piper unfiltered segment. Kid gloves are off here, brother. When they announced this last week that Roddy was going to confront Goldust on Raw, my first thought was, how soon before we hear Piper make a completely politically incorrect joke? Turns out it took all of about 5 seconds. I kid you not. Less than a minute into the dialogue, he referred to Goldust as a, quote, fruitcake, cream puff, and who could forget, transvestite. Using them $1 million words. He talked about watching Goldust's supposed Hollywood films. Yet oddly enough, Piper's never seen Goldust around in catering. Talks about how Goldust is making a mockery of everything in the sport of wrestling, including the Intercontinental Championship. Then, completely at random for no reason, he gets on the topic of sexuality. He claims that Goldust is what he is. Meanwhile, Piper is a lesbian. Excuse me? And, well, admittedly, I kind of blanked out for a sec. I was still trying to process what the hell Piper meant by that previous comment. All I know is Goldust eventually grabbed the mic. He started to grope Piper as he asked him to join him in the back lot. I presume Goldust was referring to another kind of back lot. Not the one Piper was thinking of. In any case, shit got very uncomfortable for a minute as Goldust got down on his knees, basically kneeling in front of Piper in a way that was supposed to indicate he was about to give him a blowjob. And as he circled around Piper and went to pull up his skirt to give everybody a, quote, sneak preview, Piper grabbed his wrist and told him to cut the shit out. I don't know how much of that was a work or not. Something tells me Piper was being very sincere. Probably like, all right, dude, we're on television here, taking this a bit too far. And I will admit, when they did the thing where they both slapped one another, and then Piper grabbed the mic and passionately delivered the line, "You want a backlot brawl? You got it. And I'm gonna make a man out of you." Now that shit got over in the building. People went crazy for that. If you remove all the sexual innuendos and the very unsettling nature of the whole promo, it was actually a pretty good segment to set up their match. Goes to show how great these two were as talents to be able to make something like that work. Objectively, I don't know if there were two other guys that could have pulled that off. But there's your setup for Goldust and Piper for Mania. A match that people still hold in high regard to this day. Maybe because it's Piper. Maybe because the entire match was utterly ridiculous and campy on its face. I don't know. But it still kind of worked in its own unique way. We'll talk about it in a few weeks. But I think I'll just round out the conversation by saying, if WWE would even attempt to toe the line of doing something like this in 2025, there is no possible way that the roles would not be totally reversed in this situation. Goldust would absolutely be the babyface in this feud by today's standards, which is a real fucked up thing to even think about. But that is how screwed up our culture is. I mean, we've normalized the trans thing to the point where people just look the other way and don't even think about it now. I'm not going to get into it. From there, we had Phineas and Henry Godwinn squashing two geeks. Pretty short and concise. There was a random moment in the match where Phineas started throwing a tantrum and decided to do handstands and or mule kicks. But he couldn't really pull it off, so it just looked like he was teabagging the air. Henry got the win with a slop drop. That's all I cared to write down. They had a wiener dog at ringside. I don't know why. This gimmick was death. I just laugh when I go back and think, Phineas Godwinn, how in the fuck did this guy end up getting repackaged as Midian? The Attitude Era was fucking rough, bro. And then we quite literally transition from the outhouse to the penthouse. We go from peak sports entertainment Vince comedy with the Hog Farmers to a video package with Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart in training. It's a Maximum Heat sponsor plug, as we first go to the footage of Shawn in San Antonio training with his mentor, Jose Lothario. I think most people are well aware of the HBK Lothario dynamic. And when Shawn was first breaking into the business back in '84, it was Jose who took him under his wing and trained him from scratch. I don't know the full backstory on how those two came into contact. I think they were living relatively close together in Texas at the time. And, we're actually going to see Lothario on Raw as Shawn's manager going forward. I think all the way up until early '97. I just found it funny watching this because on the one hand, they're showing you things like Shawn hitting punching bags and hiking up bleachers, monkey bar climbing, just kind of your standard basic training regimen. And then on the other hand, there's Bret Hart in the dungeon with Stu getting put in stretch holds and basically getting his ass kicked as a way to toughen him up. Of course, Bret had to throw in the line about how Shawn's roots come from the Mexican style of wrestling, but Bret doesn't really know any tough Mexican wrestlers. Such a condescending line, but I mean, we all know Bret didn't mean that intentionally. It was just very humorous. You know, his whole deal, though, is getting over the idea that Shawn has great conditioning, but he doesn't really have a moveset that stands out above what Bret's capable of doing. And he's sick of hearing all the propaganda about Shawn being the best, because there's only one best in the WWF, and that's obviously Bret. I always look back at these Bret Hart promos and interviews from the mid to late 90s. You've heard me talk about it on the channel time and time again. I was never a Bret Hart fan growing up. nor was I a Shawn Michaels fan. That's very well documented. With Bret, though, it wasn't even so much of a hatred of him. I think it was more so just having a hard time identifying with or sympathizing with him. Up until 97, he was steadily presented as a babyface on camera. And instinctually as a kid, I always knew that. He never did anything drastically evil to make you loathe everything about his personality. But his promos always came off so patronizing to me. It's like he had this visceral proclivity to always need to put himself over and, I mean, I hate to use the cliche, be a mark for himself, but that's how it always came off. And that's often been a common Bret Hart criticism you've heard over the years. The fact that he took things way too seriously and always had to put himself over at the expense of everybody else. And again, as a heel, it would make sense. But he wasn't a heel. It really goes back to that conversation we had a couple weeks ago where we were talking about the build-up to the WrestleMania match, the confrontation they did with Bret and Shawn on television. The people were naturally starting to boo Bret a little bit. I mean, it wasn't a 90-10 split in favor of Shawn, but I often wonder what the hesitation was of just having Bret lean into the more heel characteristics, try to create a more traditional babyface heel dynamic for that program. Because even when you go back and listen to this pre-tape, you're like, man, Bret's a fucking egomaniac. And truthfully, he kind of was. Not in bad spirit, but I think even Bret would probably admit back during this time that, yeah, he probably liked the smell of his own wet farts a little too much. Just something that stood out to me when I was watching this pre-tape. It was good stuff, though. It just brought me back to that topic we covered a few weeks ago. Would it have really hurt business to temporarily run with Bret as a heel for WrestleMania 12? Especially after having now heard him in this pre-tape. Sounded pretty heelish to me. So that led us to Hunter Hearst Helmsley and Ben Greer. This is where we learned that Hunter would be facing the Ultimate Warrior at WrestleMania in a couple weeks. Just randomly throwing that one out in the open. All right, then. He won with a pedigree in about 90 seconds. That's all you need to know. Then they tried to follow that with a Billionaire Ted skit. And ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform you, this was the week where I cracked. I said, I can't do it. I refuse to do it. I will not subject myself to another one of these goddamn rotten Billionaire Ted skits. At this rate, it's gone beyond Vince just trying to pleasure himself. At this point, it's on par with having a porn addiction. The only thing I wrote was, Scheme Gene tried to scam the fans into calling the hotline number. That was the whole premise. You can fill in the details as you wish. Main event. And boy, do I have questions about this one. It is a tag team match with Davey Boy and Owen Hart taking on Yokozuna and The Undertaker. Okay, pause. Question. They said that Taker and Yoko put their differences aside from their checkered past And that is how they became tag team partners for this match. How does one exactly let bygones be bygones after being stuffed inside a coffin? It's a little different from throwing a punch or having a heated debate with somebody over something. The Undertaker and Yokozuna were blood rivals for the better part of the last 3 years. Then all of a sudden, from out of the blue, because they're babyfaces now, they're just randomly teaming together for no reason. Well, that's incredibly stupid. And poorly thought out. You know what else is really stupid and poorly thought out? This match. Here's what happens. They spend the first several minutes having what essentially became a tornado rules match, where everybody's just in the ring doing whatever they want. Nobody's tagging. Nobody's following any kind of directive from Hebner, the official. And about 2 minutes in, here comes Diesel down the aisleway to lay out Paul Bearer with a clothesline. And it takes The Undertaker another full minute to realize, hey, this asshole just came down and leveled my manager. So, well, he just storms off to the back, leaving Yoko high and dry. So much for that friendship. For anybody asking, how did this not constitute a count-out loss? Well, you're assuming that Taker was the legal guy at any point prior to him walking out. I still have no idea who the legal guy was during the first several minutes of this thing. So they come back from break with the heels double-teaming Yoko. Again, tag rules were basically thrown out the window by this point. And it ends with Vader running in for the blatant disqualification. Which, of course, I then have to bring up the obvious question during situations like this. If Vader was going to interfere for the DQ anyway, why the fuck didn't he just come out after they rang the goddamn bell? It is the most infuriating booking call in all of wrestling. I never understood this. If the heel is planning to screw over the babyface, why do you need to wait until 3/4 of the way into the match to finally run out? Just hit the ring after the bell sounds. Or do it before. Quit wasting our time. So eventually you get Ahmed Johnson and Jake the Snake running out to make the save, helping to fend off the heels. It was more like Ahmed was running out to help. Jake was more or less speed walking. And then the show ends with the heels on the floor while management and the babyfaces are standing their ground in the ring. I still cannot believe this was the replacement match they went with instead of Vader versus Yoko. A 6-man tag with Ahmed Johnson and Jake Roberts getting tossed into the salad bowl. I mean, come on. Could it truly have been that bad? A one-on-one match with Yokozuna versus Vader? Actually, you know, on second thought, probably was a good idea to make that a 6-man. But that was Raw. Boy, was it. Other than me getting a slight kick out of hearing Brett bury Sean and pretty much everything regarding the Mexican style of wrestling, the rest of the show I could kind of take or leave. It is comical when you read more deeply into Brett's comments. I mean, he did essentially go out of his way to complain about how senseless the flashy high-risk ring style was. And like, all you think is, If only Brett had a podcast to review all the goddamn bullshit we see today. Good Christ, he'd have an aneurysm trying to make sense of all the drivel. Just imagine like a 2-hour podcast where Brett has to sit there and review AEW. Oh my God. I would pay a subscription to hear that. 450 splashes, corkscrew somersault planches, Canadian destroyers, the dumbest move in all of pro wrestling. Meanwhile, Brett's mainly poking fun at Sean for using diving elbow drops. But I know what the common defense is going to be. Tommy, the business has changed. It's evolved. Eat a dick. That's what I have to say about it. Anyway, that is going to round out this one. Again, going back to what we talked about with the John Cena conversation, chime in with your thoughts. Let me know how off base you think I am. Let me know if you think this is going to end up being a giant disappointment by the end. Maybe you're in the opposite boat. I don't know. But I'd love to hear opposing or comparing thoughts. We will be back on Friday for classic reviews and all the normal stuff you usually tune into. Coming up on WrestleMania, or WrestleMania 12, it's at the end of the month. Again, I still have to remind myself that WrestleMania 41 isn't until mid-April. It's a ways out. But we'll stay active on the channel as much as we possibly can, and I'll bring you the best quality that I can muster up. Catch you guys soon. Peace out.